come once again to discuss things.
Your old pal Scythe Part 2 here with my good friend Rotten DeBile for another episode of Ghouly Gentlemen Horror Month. I'm still going for it, man. If I lose my voice by the end of the month, it'll be worth it. I do a decent Crypt Keeper, but man, that is hard. I have no idea how the main guy does it for such an extended period of time and years after the fact. Anyway, yes, here we are for another episode of Geeky Gentleman Horror Month. Manos is supposed to be joining us. I don't know what happened to him, but hey, it's whatever. We're reviewing a movie that someone else picked for us, right, Ruben?
Yes, we are talking about the, I believe, 2014 movie, The Babadook.
The Babadook. So yeah, this is interesting because I definitely had heard about this movie a lot. It's just one of those things like, oh yeah, I'll get to that. And, you know. How about you? Have you heard of this at all?
I think I had heard of it, but I didn't know anything about what it was about or anything like that. I just knew it was, kind of a lot of these horror movies, I'll hear about them and then they all just kind of blur together for me. So like if you had a gun to my head and you told me to describe The Conjuring or Insidious or like what's the difference, I wouldn't know the difference. So like this was kind of one of those. It had just kind of blended into all those other horror movies that I didn't know anything about.
No, that's totally fair. I didn't know much about this. Like, I knew it was kind of something to do with, like, a mother, a child, and, like, kind of a monster under the bed situation. Mm-hmm. But that was literally it. I didn't know anything about the context of the film or the way the Babadook worked or anything like that. I don't know, so why don't you kind of take us off on a start here? What was your read on the film? What was your opinion of the film?
It is a very smart film. It's not what I was expecting. I think for me, I don't watch a lot of horror, and most of the time, the horror that I do watch is like a very formulaic slasher movie. So like the Halloween movies, Nightmare on Elm Street, what's another one that's kind of like that? You got like Freddy, Michael, Jason. What was the other one? Friday the 13th.
Yeah, Jason, Michael, Freddy, Hellraiser.
Yeah, all those, especially like the Jason, Freddy, and Michael. It's all like you have your typical normal, basic teenage girl, and then like she's got her 4 friends and they all get killed in gruesome ways and the monster almost kills her, and that's kind of my experience with horror movies, and a lot of times it's not very good. It's just like, oh, okay, that was a lot like all those other horror movies that I've seen. This is it's very clearly about something, and we can talk about that later, but and it's not, I don't think it's very subtle what it's about, but I still think it's handled very well. And so I think that it's, and it's also very smart with this budget. I was reading up on it, and it's like had a $2 million budget, but it still manages to be evocative and be very effective, even though you don't see really any of the monster until the 3rd act of the movie. So it's being very smart with how it uses its budget, but it still keeps you going up until you do see the monster.
Yeah, definitely. Let me get your read on this, because I found myself thinking this during the movie. This is a long movie.
Okay.
But it's an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I was blown away by that. I was watching this movie, like, I was trying to find the movie, and I did, and I was like, okay, how long is it going to be? And it said an hour and a half. I'm like, oh, that's actually really surprising. I expected it to be longer. And then I sat down, and I was watching, like, oh my god, this could not possibly be any longer. It's hard enough to watch as is. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, the pacing for this movie makes an hour and a half feel like 3 hours of dread. I am just so worried about everything on screen constantly throughout this movie. It drags every second it can out of you, and that is really impressive, I felt.
Yeah, and part of that might be, I know for me, like, one of the, I'm sorry, I get all of the slasher movies confused. Which one is it that's on Crystal Lake with Jason? Is that Nightmare?
That's Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th. One of those, there was a point a few years ago where like 5 of them were on Netflix, and so I watched through like 3 or 4 of them before I just got bored with it. And there's one of them where there is not a kill for like 45 minutes, and I remember just being bored. Like, and I found the characters to be compelling enough, but I also was like, looking at my watch, like, when are we going to get some murder? I want to see someone die. And maybe I'm a sociopath.
That's just what Ruben does in his free time. He just stares out the window at his job.
Yeah. But, like, it's possible, like, that's how you're conditioned with a monster movie or a horror movie. Like, you go in and it's like, okay, you got this creepy looking thing with the smiley face. It looks like it comes out of like Nightmare Before Christmas, like something that Tim Burton drew. And then you're thinking, okay, this monster's going to be killing people every 15 minutes. And then you don't get that for like an hour. It's just the mom having trouble raising her kid. And so it's kind of builds up this sense of like, okay, maybe it's going to happen in this next scene, and then it doesn't. And so like your, not really anxiety, but your anticipation kind of builds up, if that makes sense. Maybe that's kind of what's going on.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. This movie just really sucks you in a way that I think is really unique to horror. Like, every medium has its own innate abilities to, how to put this, to pull you in, and every genre can do things differently in any medium that just other genres can't do. Like, comedy can pull off character interactions in a way that drama can't. Like, if you had a character do something in a drama the same as a character does something in a comedy, that character could come off like an awful person, and so on and so forth. Horror has this ability to make you just... It makes the most mundane things just like white-knuckling to watch. Just grasping. So, like, the most simple shit, and you see it in a ton of horror movies, is like the music builds and the character slowly goes to open a door or something, and, you know, you're just waiting for something awful to happen, and then it doesn't, but then it does. And that's not, like, that's kind of the formula for the jump scare, but it doesn't even have to be the jump scare. It can be a lot of things. And that's in here. Like, when the old lady goes to knock on the door after the mother's been taken over by the Babadook, right? Like, that entire scene is just, what's she gonna do to this old woman? It's horrifying. And then nothing happens. It's really freaky shit. So you definitely have a lot of stuff like that. And this movie does a great job of just dragging those moments out and just making you feel so uncomfortable. And I really, really like that about it. It's a freaky watch, no lie.
Yeah. And so much of it is, you know, like I said, it's like an hour of the movie. You don't see any... you get a little bit of supernatural stuff, like she tears up the book and then later finds the book intact in the house. Like, that's supernatural. But most of the first two-thirds of the movie is just her having trouble raising her son, but it still manages to evoke that sense of horror that a lot of times other movies have to cheat to get to. And we talked about that last week, like jump scares and stuff like that. So, like, this movie does a really good job without even doing a lot of the horror stuff that it's advertised as.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's doing just a lot with your expectations of a horror movie, and that's what kind of impressively allows it to get really into the characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I found that interesting. Um, so why don't we go ahead and just get into the meat of the film then? Ruben, what's the film about?
You got this mother. Her husband died in a car wreck sometime before the movie starts, and she is raising her son. And I don't think it actually explicitly says in the movie, but I believe her son is either autistic or he's like suffering from some kind of like not post-traumatic stress, but like he's traumatized by his father's death, and her son. He is possibly hallucinating this monster called the Babadook, and he has this pop-up book that talks about it. And then her son's going through problems at school, and then she works at a retirement home, and then eventually this monster starts creeping into their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think there's much ground for the idea that the kid's autistic. I think he's just a bit of, maybe you could go with like ADD, ADHD if you want to put like a diagnosis on it.
Okay.
I don't know.
I don't mean anything. I don't mean an insult by it.
No, I gotcha. I'm just saying I just didn't get that read of it. I got just a much more general kind of, maybe you could put that on it, but I think he's just kind of a bad kid.
You know, I was thinking it, and I didn't want to say it because a lot of times in this movie when the kid was doing stuff, I was thinking, man, this kid's a brat. But then I was thinking, boy, I'm a real jerk if it turns out that he's suffering from something. But because like I've seen like at my work, like I would see a kid come in with their mom, and the kid would just be constantly like, mom, 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 and then the mom is just completely ignoring the kid, and I'm thinking like, hey, mom, you could spend like a minute and a half and like pay attention to your kid. But then also, I don't have a kid, and I don't have any right to tell someone how to raise their kid, especially when they're with the kid all day. And so like watching this movie, I was kind of having that same thing where it's like the kid would be just constantly like there's no barriers at all. Like the mom has no personal space. Like, you know, she might be in the bathroom and the kid would just like start knocking on the door like, hey, mom, 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 mom. And so like, it on the one, I kind of was going back and forth. Like on the one hand, I was like, man, this kid is such a brat. But on the other hand, I was like, I feel really bad for the mom too. Like, and I don't know what her solution should be. Like that's another thing watching the movie. Like, what's she gonna do? Like, and
I think a lot of that's intentional. I think the filmmaker wants you to kind of realize this kid is just a problem, and it kind of gets to the idea of like single parenthood, single motherhood in particular, and how difficult that can be, particularly for her in this situation where she lost her husband, and she's clearly dealing with a lot of pent up emotions in regards to her child because of that. So, you know, stuff like that's definitely there. And so you could maybe put a diagnosis on the kid. They certainly talk about how he's got problems in school, problems socializing and stuff, but I don't know if that's really, I don't know if the intent is that he's actually got some kind of mental illness or something. I think they're just really trying to show you he's just a very difficult child to raise. He's not a bad kid. He's just very emotional, very difficult. And I thought that was interesting. But what I meant more when I said, what's the movie about? I meant more the theme, the connection. What is the Babadook? What's the movie trying to say? And so I'll throw out my interpretation and see if we come down in the same place on this. This is a movie about not only depression, but I think in particular postpartum depression.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say I would add on that, like, just like you said, just in general, like being a single parent and having a kid who is more difficult to raise than a typical kid. And that sounds mean saying that, but like I would say going that far. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, the scenes that really, really sold that idea as to what the film's deeper themes are trying to deal with, definitely the moment where she starts yelling at her sons, like, "You have no idea how many times I wished it was you that died instead of him." In regards to her husband dying and not her son. Lots of, like, there's that moment. Then there's in particular the moment where the Babadook you can't get rid of the Babadook. That was the thing that really sealed it in for me, the idea that it is a metaphor for depression. And initially I was going to go so far as to say that the Babadook isn't real at all. That it is all just inside her head, and she kind of let her son's imagination run away with the both of them.
Yeah.
But then there's like certain things that physically happen on film, like the child getting pulled up the stairwell and like the room falling apart and stuff like that. That makes the implication, to me at least, that the Babadook is a physical manifestation of this in the world of the film. But for a while there, everything's just kind of about sleep deprivation and weirdness, and then some of the other stuff, like the book being returned and all that stuff, could have possibly been justified if it was her kind of going crazy or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And you mentioned that, like, how the monster, there is no climactic destruction of the creature at the end. That's what you come to expect from the horror movies I mentioned. Like, Freddy, Michael, or Jason, like, they get destroyed in some increasingly more melodramatic way in each movie, and that's what you generally expect. Like, they fall down, I don't know, a glass cutting machine or something like that. Like, and it's the final girl, going after the monster. And so you kind of expect the mom to have some, like, pick up a chainsaw and say, like, get away from my son. You expect that. And then it's not what it happens. Like, that to me kind of took me by surprise. That this movie completely subverts the monster ending with these kinds of movies.
Yeah, I think so. The idea that they didn't have to keep the Babadook as a pet because it's just constantly with them, I thought was really an interesting subversion, and yeah, it's just creepy as shit. That whole scene in the basement at the end of the movie was really surprising, and I don't know if it made the message stronger or muddied the waters a bit. That's something we can get into. But yeah, you're definitely right. It is anything but typical of the Hollywood movie monster ending kind of thing.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to go so far as to say, like, oh, just because it's a subversion means that it's automatically good or better. But I think in this case, like, I'm expecting it to go a very typical, like, and I would say cliche way of doing horror movies, and because it doesn't, like, I found myself genuinely enjoying it a little bit more because it didn't do what I was expecting. So a lot of times I would say just because it's a subversion doesn't automatically improve on it, but I think in this case it did.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the subversion works here. It's definitely made by someone who understands what the inner workings of horror can be. I think it works really well on that level. It's definitely thinking about itself as a horror movie. It's trying its best to actually be scary in more ways than booga booga booga. And so I really appreciate that, because I don't know, there's something so human. Like, everyone obviously loves their family, but everyone also, like, secretly hates things about their family members. Everyone's got, like, those things about their family members that just drive them up the wall or something. And so this kind of, it does a thing that horror is just really well suited for, is it takes those emotions those brief emotions, right? Those just like, I just want to slam your head into the wall emotions that you never act on but definitely cross your mind. It takes those turns it up to 11, and literalizes it on screen.
Yeah.
So, like, you mentioned that, you know, the kid in the store kind of thing, and I think everyone's experienced, you know, the kid in the store that's being annoying and the parent that's not paying any attention to him. And I think everyone's had, like, a relative or a sibling or something that annoyed the crap out of them, and you just wanted to strike them or something, but you didn't, because you're the responsible older one or whatever situation. I think everyone's experienced that stuff, and so this is playing on the horror of what if someone actually did that? What if someone did actually hate their child and did, you know, try to kill them? How scary is that? And it's super scary. You've got, like, the way the mother is played when she's snapped, when she's got the Babadook in her, is just absolutely horrifying. Like, you know, she's yelling and screaming one minute, and then the next minute she's acting all sweet, trying to lure her child so that she can kill him. It's so freaky.
Yeah, and that would take that's a very particular kind of acting. They could have gotten any other actor, and this could have very easily not worked as well.
I think so.
I want to go back a little bit to the taking the human element and putting it as a literal monster on screen. I don't want to say this as a general statement, but I think some of the best, not just horror stories, but like just a lot of genre type stories in general, I think they work best when they do that. When we were talking about Nosferatu, that's kind of what Dracula is about, is like, you know, taking the like sexual, not deviancy, but like, I guess just the act of sexuality and turning it into a monstrous event. That's a lot of what the whole vampire mythos is about. And like you look at Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, especially like the early seasons, a lot of those creatures that she fights are a metaphor for something that a high schooler is going through. And that's kind of what Teeth is about. Like, you know, a lot of these horror movies we've talked about this month are all about that to some degree. And I want to say a lot of the best horror movies tend to do that.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of these movies have this element going through them, and that's what distinguishes them from, you know, a good movie and a bad movie. A lot of the really bad schlocky horror movies are just trying to get by on effects and budget and cheap jump scare kind of stuff. That's kind of what the Saw movies became. But you go back and you watch the original Saw, and there's an argument there. There's a point there. There's something like... I don't think it's beyond the pale to say people have had thoughts like that. That it's a fairly common thing for people to think, like, oh, this person doesn't even deserve the life they have, or this person doesn't deserve to be alive, you know? I think that's a common thought that people experience, and it's one that I think a lot of people are ashamed to admit or would say, oh, no, I've never thought like that, but they probably aren't being truly self-critical. And I think horror is a really good medium for exploring that idea of being self-critical. So, you know, we talk about Dracula and the vampire as a metaphor for sexuality and the shaming of sexuality and stuff. And so it's a critique of this attempt at the time by these Puritan society kind of thing to shame sexuality. It's like, well, if you do that, you're going to push it inside and it's just going to become a fucking monster in you. Is kind of the critique that's making in some regards.
Yeah.
And so this is a really good example of that. If you take these little bits of bitterness that build up in a relationship with a family member over time, and you just keep storing it away and trying to pretend it's not there and trying to act like, no, I don't think that way because bad people think that way and I'm not a bad person. If you just try to run from it and hide from it, all you're doing is making it worse. And that was kind of the whole point when the book comes back in the film, right? Because when it comes back and it's all stitched together, it has new pages in it. And it straight says something to the effect of, the more you try to deny me, the stronger I get. And I think that's really there. I think that is an actual emotion that, it's not a pretty emotion. It's not something to be proud of. It's not something like, oh yeah, I think about murdering my child every day. But it's an emotion that legitimately exists in people. And that if you don't acknowledge and say, okay, I have these awful or shameful thoughts from time to time, but I'm acknowledging those and dealing with those, then that's the part that actually prevents you from acting on it, as opposed to, actually acting on it or shaming it away.
Yeah. And that's kind of what the movie's about at the end. Like, she doesn't get rid of it. She accepts it and moves on and becomes, they become a better family unit at the end. Like, you can tell it's not just her who's improved. Like, their whole relationship has improved on both sides there at the end.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because I think this is worth discussing, since we are talking about something like, violence against children, kind of a touchy subject. Do you think, because I mentioned earlier that the Babadook, if you ignore certain scenes, really can be seen as just her going crazy. It's not actually a part of the film. And I don't think that's the case by the end of the film, but regardless. Do you think that the Babadook being a literal monster that literally took her over kind of gives her a free pass, where if that wasn't the case, if this was just a psychotic trip, do you think that she should get to have this character arc, that she should be able to keep her kid and be a better family because of it? Or do you think that maybe she's getting a little easy, and that, because she was allowed herself even temporarily to be overrun with this kind of bitterness, that she should probably have lost her kid?
I don't think that, I don't think it's all the Babadook. Like, I think it's partly her that's, like, there towards the end when she's starting to become more unhinged, and then at one point she's fully possessed by the monster, but I don't think it's all the monster. I think we don't see the Babadook, it's only affecting this family. It's not affecting other families. So I think part of that is because she's already conducive to the Babadook, like, taking over. Like, she's already having issues at home with her child, and so the Babadook, it's a better environment for the creature to take over. And as such, I don't know if I wouldn't give her a free pass, but I think that she learns from this whole experience, and I like to think that there's a happy ending here, and that it's not gonna end up being like just a really horrible life for both of them, like a day after the movie ends, So even though I do think part of it is on her, and then a lot of it is on the monster, I also don't think that I'm trying to think of a delicate way to say it. I think she can be kind of forgiven for, like, the burdens are kind of piling up on her, like raising this kid who is very difficult. Like, we've already talked about that. Like, he looks like he's a handful. And so I would never condone, like, pulling a knife on your kid like she does at one point, or, brandishing a knife toward him. But, I can say, like, maybe it's understandable that she kind of flips out.
Well, I don't know. It's interesting because the scene, one of their last scenes together is with the Child Protective Services. And shortly after that, she kind of moves the collar of his shirt, and you see bruising around his neck.
Oh, yeah.
And so the implication there is that she was hiding the bruising from the Child Protective Services. And within the context of the story, yes, it's because of the monster that she went that far. And there's no... I don't think there's any debate to be had about whether the Babadook is real by the end of this film. I think it is definitely real in the context of the film.
Right.
But I do wonder if maybe that gives her more of a pass if she got kind of a get out of jail free card, because, you know, if the movie were different than the movie we watched, which obviously it's not, then that scene would just be really, really awkward and weird, and you'd kind of feel maybe even more bad for the kid, because now he's stuck in this home and he doesn't know any better. He thinks his mom was possessed by a monster from his perspective. So it's just, I don't know, it creates a weird dynamic that, you know, I don't recall really seeing stuff like that in a horror film, or any film really. The idea of someone that has hurt a child, you know, getting to keep the child is a really subversive idea to put in a film, and I think it works in context here, but I do think that it's a bit of a surprising turn to pull off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had actually forgotten about that scene with the bruise, and her trying to hide it almost makes it seem like it was more her than the monster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
And that does kind of puts a troubling light on it, but also I think it's kind of like, I don't know, this is kind of a weird way to compare it, but it's kind of like in Ghostbusters 2, where the slime, like, makes them all flip out at each other in the restaurant, and, like, part of that is the slime, like, pushing them, but also it's like there was already a little bit of it there anyway. And that's actually not a great example, because that movie doesn't really explore that, but it's kind of like that, where it's like there's a little bit of it there, and then an external force is kind of pushing it to its extreme. And so it's hard to say that it's not her fault, because, like I said, like, we don't see the Babadook affecting anyone else. And this is a very, I guess I should say, what I like about this is, compared to all those other horror movies that I talked about, this is a very tight focused cast. You have two main characters, and you have like a couple of other minor characters, like the sister and her kid. Like, we see the sister I think 2 times. So we don't have this huge flood of supporting characters who are all here just to get killed by the Babadook. Like, that's what you would do if it was Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. You would have like 5 or 6 characters, and then by the end of the movie you would have like 1 or 2, and that's what you would do. You would kill off a whole bunch of them just to show, like, the bad guy means business. But this movie doesn't do that. We start with the same number that we have at the end, and we're able to focus on these characters a lot more throughout the whole movie, and I really like that. And so I don't remember what got me started on that subject, but I think that it's I guess it's hard to tell if this Babadook, if it's affecting other families, but I think because we are only seeing it affect this one, that we have to assume that there's something, and I keep returning to that, but I think that that's kind of important when we're trying to determine.
Oh, no, definitely. I do think that, you know, the context of the movie itself shows that it's not entirely her fault, that she probably wouldn't have gone off and tried to murder her child if not for the influence of the monster. That I'm not going to try to debate with someone. I just think it's weird to kind of show that. I think that it's a bold choice on the part of the filmmakers to try to show someone who has physically hurt their child as redeemed. That is a rare thing to see in film. I just want to kind of acknowledge that and move on. All right, something else with this movie that I found was interesting. You mentioned the very small cast. You know, we talked about the fact that this kid is just really, really difficult. One thing I really like is the kid gets better and better, and the mom gets worse and worse as the movie goes on. Yeah. And that's exemplified really well in one scene, kind of before the night when everything goes wrong. When she tries to take him to this kid's restaurant that he really likes or whatever. I think they call it Wally's. Yeah. And they're sitting in a booth next to a family where the kids are just being fucking impossible. and the two of them are just sitting there quiet as hell.
Uh-huh.
I think that's a really good example of just showing just how much their relationship, how much their dynamic has changed throughout the film.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And that's a really good, it's a really simple way of showing that character development. Like I said, this movie is really smart with its budget, and that's not even necessarily a budget issue, but it's just really smart writing across the board, where it's like, we need a simple, effective way to show that they've changed. I know, let's show another family and show how horrible they are. Like, it's easy, and it's something that a lot of writers wouldn't think to do, probably.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was pretty good. What else with this one? The way that the kid is shown, like, yeah, he's not a good kid, but he's not an awful kid. Mm-hmm. I thought was interesting. Like when he's over at his, what would it be, his cousin's house, and they're both in the tree house, and she's just being awful to him.
Yeah.
Like, you could say that this kid's bad all you want. His cousin is just mean.
Uh-huh.
Like, needlessly mean. He's not even doing anything. He doesn't even want to be there. He's off on his own in the treehouse, and she comes up to hurt him.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, and you can understand the mom, not the main character, but the aunt, the mom of the cousin. You can understand her reaction when her daughter gets pushed out of the treehouse, but because she didn't see what was going on in the treehouse, but also, like, you're right, that cousin was being horrible, and like it's one of those things where, because like, you have to assume it's because she's not a main character that she's allowed to be just completely awful. But also, like, I like to think that maybe that character, if given more screen time, would be a little bit more redeemable. Maybe. I don't know. I just think it's interesting because we don't get this enough in film. So much with film wants to show the idea, like, visual language and storytelling wants to get across certain things. And so 9 times out of 10 when we see a kid on screen, they are there to personify innocence. They're there to be the image of innocence. And then when they're not, they're there to be, like, the butt of a joke or to be taught a lesson or something like that. Very rarely do we just let kids act like actual children on screen. And so guess what? Sometimes children are awful, and they don't get to learn anything from it. They're just awful. Children are terrible people sometimes, and they're allowed to be because they're still learning how to be good people. They're still learning how to be people. Good people might be a bit of a stretch, but still, like, that's just a thing. Children are just awful people sometimes, and that's, I don't know. You don't get to see that enough on film. I feel like I'm sure someone will leave a comment saying, well, what about this movie? I'm like, yeah, there's obviously exceptions, but like 90% of the time when you see a kid on film, it's a really basic message the director's trying to get across. So getting to see this little girl just be horrendous in this treehouse, it's a big deal. Yeah, and it's I feel like this is one of those things where, I don't know, this almost seems like it had to have come from a real life experience. I don't know, but this seems like one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, that happened to me. Like, my cousin was horrible. I didn't push him out a window or anything, but like, my cousin said some really mean things to me, and I wrote it into the script or something like that.
Yeah, I can see where you come from there. I don't know, man. There's a lot of really interesting, subtle things. Like, I'm thinking again about that birthday party scene, and it's, again, the kid is behaving better and better, partly because of just how horrified he is.
Yeah.
But the mom is getting worse and worse. So, like, and not to say that this is a huge problem, but it's in the film, it's meant to communicate it subtly. She starts taking off work early. She starts skipping work altogether. She starts asking their doctor for drugs. She randomly bites a lady's head off for just kind of complaining about her day. And yeah, I mean, it's annoying when someone's complaining about something petty while you're going through something awful in your life. But at the same time, everyone's got their shit. People are allowed to complain about their shit. Maybe that lady could have been more tactful or whatever, but she don't know your life.
Yeah.
So, like, there's shit like that. So, like, the mother's just becoming more and more unhinged throughout the movie, and the child's becoming more and more stable until he basically has to be the one, you know, taking care of them by the end of the movie. And it's interesting because the movie's very aware that he's filling that role, with him at one point directly saying, you know, promise to take care of me and I promise I'll take care of you, to his mother. And that's really weird for a kid to have to say, especially a kid that young.
Yeah, and it's kind of sad. Like, you don't want to see that even in a movie. Like, I'm really weird about, like, when I watch a movie or TV show or read a book where two friends stop being friends, like, I always want to see them get back together, even though I fully understand in real life sometimes friends just drift apart. There doesn't have to be anything melodramatic that split the friends apart. And I understand it happens in real life, so I'm still weird. So, like, stuff like that really gets me emotionally. And I don't, like, cry or anything, but this is kind of the same way. Like, if you see a kid who has to be the grown-up in a family situation, that always gets me like, oh, that's really disappointing and really sad.
Yeah, I'd get you there. Everyone's got those things, and that it's communicated really well in this film, I think.
It's more sad. It's more emotionally evocative than the monster itself. Like, you know, like I said, you know, this is a movie you kind of expect it to be just another dumb monster movie, but really it's the emotions that are the horror part, and the monster's just kind of the icing on the cake, and the cake is like the really delicious part.
Yeah, no, I agree. What's really impressive is he becomes more if not the adult, more the responsible one throughout the entire film. And I like the way that it plays with kind of the tropes of horror, because I think we've all, like, Home Alone kind of did it to a more comedic degree, but it's a trope that's in a lot of horror movies, particularly from the 80s and 90s, of, like, the elaborate homemade traps that are there to, you know, ensnare the monster kind of things. I think particularly about, like, Nightmare on Elm Street, the very first one, when she pulls Freddy into the real world and she's, like, turned her house into a guerrilla warfare thing to attack Freddy with, and all this stuff. So, like, the kid is put in this position where he's got to take down the monster, and the monster is his mother, and he's got to kind of lure her into all these traps. And sure, they work, but they also suck. They're just, like, they look like something a 6-year-old would actually be able to come up with, because he has that little an understanding of engineering.
Yeah.
To the point where he's, like, you know, like, he ties her down and stuff to try to save her soul, exercise her or whatever. It doesn't really work. She's out of those knots in a couple seconds. So I don't know, there's something to that. There's something that, like, just makes it kind of heartbreaking that he's the responsible one, but he's still a fucking child, and he has a child's understanding of the world. The traps kind of exemplify that.
Yeah, and usually, you know, you were saying that, like, most of the time you're going to see a kid, and they're going to be portrayed as, like, ultra innocent and, like, the epitome of purity. I will say also another thing you usually see with children is they're either... well, most of the time it's like you're going to have this really precocious child who's, like, does not talk like normal children, talks, like, way above whatever age group they are in, because the writer is someone in their 30s or 40s, and it's been 20 or 30 years since they were that age. And so this does a really good job of having him act his age, and maybe he's still a handful, but like you said, like these contraptions that he builds, they don't look like something that Thomas Edison built. They look like something that a kid this age actually worked on.
I mean, yeah, to an extent. I'd say maybe his little catapult backpack thing is maybe a little much.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's into magic, so I kind of... It's enough of a conceit that I could buy it. Because, I mean, that doesn't seem too hard to make, but I don't know. It's a little iffy, but it still works within the context of the film. Yeah, I don't know. There's something to that. Just... It's really interesting to see how sophisticated the kid gets throughout the film. Like, when his mother's trying to get him to take his medicine, like a double dose of it or whatever, and he straight, like, palms it because he's into magic. I thought that was pretty good. Yeah. So I thought, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff like that that's really interesting in this film. So in a movie called The Babadook, you know what we haven't talked about very much?
What?
The Babadook?
Yeah.
So what do you think of the monster in and of itself?
I think it's a really good design. That's something that you don't often see people talk about, like the design of a monster. It's mostly just like, it's either scary or it's not, and like, I hate to keep going back to these three, movies that I keep talking about, but that's
Man,
like...
I'm going to make you, like, eat your words. We're going to have to talk about Nightmare on Elm Street at some point, because that is a better movie than you're giving it credit for.
To be fair, I haven't actually seen Nightmare. I've seen I've seen a couple of the Halloween movies, and I saw, like, 3 of the Friday the 13th movies. So, like, okay. And I'm just, like, in my mind, I'm just saying that they're all the same, but really, like, I haven't seen any of the Freddy Krueger movies, so those probably are, like, really good, but
they vary in quality, but Nightmare the First is better than I feel you're giving it credit for.
But, like, with those movies, like, those, like, they're very simple designs. Like, it's a dude wearing a hockey mask, and even that, it wasn't until, like, the 3rd movie that he had it. Or it's it's a guy wearing just a normal, I think, what is it, Michael Myers? It's a Michael Myers mask or whatever.
It's actually Kirk.
Yeah, that's right.
Turned inside out.
Michael Myers is a character, right? That's what I was thinking of.
I would love to see a Halloween movie where Michael Myers wears a Michael Myers mask. Yeah, baby, yeah.
What was oh man, there was a movie. It wasn't oh man, it was a heist movie just recently, that, like, in the last year or two, where somebody said he wanted a Michael Myers mask and his partner got an Austin Powers mask for him. Oh man, I don't remember that movie either. But anyway, the design of the monster, I think, is really good. And I'm assuming that's where most of the budget went, because the rest of the movie is kind of just, normal human stuff. But I think it's pretty creepy what we get of it.
No, it really is. The proportions keep changing, which is just... I hate that shit.
Yeah.
That just fucking unnerves me when the proportions are wrong and when they're also not consistent. So when you fucking put both of those things together, it just fucks with me. That's really weird. He's got, like, this roach movement kind of thing, like when he's crawling on the ceiling in her dream. That's super fucky. That one really fucked me. And then just, I don't know, it's got such a weird movement whenever you do see it. Most of the time it just appears, sometimes it crawls, sometimes it just fucking slides across the room like a phantom. And that shit is scary. Anything that does that, like when the mom's possessed by him and she starts moving like that, that's really freaky shit. That really worked for me. So yeah, I really do like the design. I like the way they have him move on screen is super creepy. And the way it just appears in the frame, like, randomly. She's looking over at her neighbor, and then just there he is in the background. She's at the police station, looks over the guy's shoulder. He's laying there. The one that got me the most was when she's watching the silent films and he just kept appearing in the films.
Yeah.
Because it was so natural looking. I couldn't tell if they went and like made scenes that looked like they were from old silent films and just put the actor or costume or whatever in them, or if they spliced it into actual silent films. But whatever it did, it looked really, really good in a freaky way.
Yeah, and it kind of reminded me of the It miniseries from the 90s, where they're reading the book and it's showing the old parade from like the 30s, and then Pennywise is like in the background. Kind of reminded me of that.
Okay, yeah, I got you there.
And the I was thinking, actually, this is not so much about the design of the monster, but the whole last act of the movie kind of reminds me, and I haven't actually seen or read it, but I'm familiar with it. It kind of reminds me of The Shining, mostly because you've got a mother and son running from a monstrous entity of some kind, and in The Shining, it's just her husband, but in this, it's an actual monster. But it kind of reminded me of that just on that superfluous level, and I was wondering if you kind of picked up on that or if I'm just reading too much into it.
No, now that you say that, I could kind of get it, because Jack kind of gets possessed by the spirit of the house, or of the hotel, the spirit of the Overlook, and kind of goes on a rampage, and it's up to Danny and his mom to just get away from it. I definitely see the connection there, because then it's just kind of up to the kid to deal with this, parental figure who's now really, really scary, and I find that kind of interesting. I don't know. That's an interesting parallel. I wonder how much of it is just, that's just how you do horror. That's just a scary ass thing to deal with. It's like kind of, on some level, I'm not sure if there's a legitimate connection there. Or if I'm just like, that's just a trope of horror, is the parent tries to kill the child.
Yeah, and it could be, once, if I started to like dip my toe into horror more, I could be like, oh, okay, this is a thing in all of these other things that I'm not familiar with. Mostly just my very limited knowledge of horror stuff made me think of The Shining first.
No, that's fair. You should watch The Shining. It's good. It's the best horror film ever made.
What is your opinion of the one they did a remake with the guy from Wings?
I watched about 2 minutes of it, and I said, yep, Stephen King doesn't understand taste.
Stephen King doesn't understand The Shining.
No, he really doesn't. It's funny. We did a 1408 and The Shining in the same year, I want to say last horror month, and it's amazing because Stephen King's The Shining is very different than Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And so everyone kind of just acknowledges that Stephen King's is not as good. And so Stephen King's like, well, fine, I can do the same kind of ideas that Kubrick was going for. And then he does 1408. And it's a good movie, but it's not the same. But it's definitely him trying to go for more of Kubrick's tone for what The Shining was. Anyway, regardless of that. So the other things I like about the Babadook, as far as just how he works, I find really, really interesting. Like we mentioned, the whole, you kind of need the door half open already. Where the book comes from, I find really freaky, because I think everyone's had that experience of finding something in their home and they have no idea how it got there.
Yeah.
Not like something was put there, but like something that's clearly been there for a while and you just don't know where it came from. That's kind of just naturally freaky. Then there's just the way that he's structured here as a metaphor, in my opinion at least, by my read of the film, as a metaphor for postpartum depression, I found really, really interesting. That idea of the mother that... Because that's a really freaky, weird... bit of psychology that just deals with how complex the human mind is, because what that all kind of is like, all right, so a woman has a child, and then she feels depressed because she feels overwhelmed by the child. Then she feels anger toward the child for feeling overwhelmed by it. Then she feels more depressed because she knows that makes her a bad mother for being angry at her child. And so it just creates this really weird cycle in the head, and that's kind of what's going on with what the Babadook is affecting here. And it makes me wonder if there will be, or if you even could do a sequel to this.
I was actually reading about that. The director, she holds the rights to the movie completely, and she said there will never be a sequel.
Oh, interesting.
She said it's not that kind of movie. She didn't explain what kind of movie it was, because you and I kind of came out of it, like you were saying it's more about like postpartum depression, and I was initially thinking it was more about raising a non-typical what's the way that's described, like neurotypical, raising a non-neurotypical child. That's kind of what I was thinking about when I first watched it. So like, she didn't explain what the movie is about, but she was saying it's not that kind of, I'm assuming she means like typical Hollywood
franchisable movie.
Yeah, which most horror movies seem to be. Like,
well, what usually happens is like the first horror movie is made really cheap and kind of on a shoestring budget, and it's just a really clever idea that someone has, and then it ends up being really successful. It makes a bunch of money because it didn't spend anything to make it, and then it gets bought up by the Hollywood machine, and they just fuck it up in sequel after sequel. That's what next year's horror month should be. Only sequels.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Nah, I don't want to do that. That's too limiting, but it's a fun idea.
I don't know. There's a lot of sequels, but yeah, it'd probably get boring real quick too.
Well, I mean, it's funny. For some reason, it's horror and porn that every movie has 15 sequels.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I definitely see where the director's coming from in that regard. I do feel like there's the potential, at least, for the Babadook as a concept to work in sequels if it's done right. I could definitely see that they don't want to make a sequel because it would maybe get taken away and run away with and all this stuff, and they don't want that. But if you do it right and you keep focusing it, in my opinion at least, as a summation or a metaphor for dark emotions, I think that could really work. Like, here it's depression in general, postpartum depression in particular. For other stuff, like, I don't know, what about the Babadook, but play with the ideas around PTSD?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like there's some interesting stuff you could do there with regards to mental illness and brain disorders. Babadook as the psychological monster kind of becomes really interesting because there's no cure for psychological disorders most of the time. Most of the time, they're lifelong things that you just kind of have to live with, have to deal with on a regular basis. And so it creates really interesting ground, in my opinion, for sequels, whereas other movies in the horror franchise really don't. Like, you have to make a really strong argument that Saw ever needed a sequel.
That's one I never did watch any of the Saw movies. I think the first one had to have come out when you and I were in high school, right?
I want to say 2003, so I think I was in middle school when Saw came out. Yeah, that was the 2000s horror franchise. What's really funny, just this neither here nor there, but I just find it amusing. So the first Saw movie came out and it made pretty good amount of money because it was cheap as hell to make and yada 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 yada. then they decided, all right, we're going to greenlight a sequel. And simultaneously, this guy was shopping around a script about a bunch of people trapped in a house and they have to go through all these awful things in order to get out of the house. And everyone was like, oh, this is really similar to that Saw movie that just came out. Like, and the guy's like, well, no, it's not intended to be. And eventually the studio behind Saw got together with him and was like, hey, we'll produce this if you just rewrite it to be a sequel to Saw. And he's like, okay. So that's why the second Saw movie is any good, is because it was originally just its own movie, as opposed to trying to recapture the magic kind of thing that so many horror movies fail to do in their sequels.
That's like Die Hard. I think like several of the Die Hard sequels were originally supposed to be a different movie.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I wanted to mention the coat at the police station. I thought I wasn't sure if that was like the Babadook actually acting that early in the movie, or if that was just her imagination kind of like prepping the way for the Babadook. I wasn't sure what you thought about that.
I don't see the distinction.
Okay.
I truly do not see any distinction between those two things. Yes. That is my answer to you. Yes.
Yeah, and either way, like, it's still effective horror right there, and like you don't see a single ounce of monster in that scene, but it's still creepy enough to like get you whoa. And, like, if you have it on DVD, you want to rewind it a little bit and like figure out, wait, did I just see that? Oh yeah, I did. Okay, that is creepy.
All right. Well, what else can we talk about with this one? We need a few more minutes to go.
You were saying, like, if we could make a sequel, like, this kind of reminds me of the Grindel comics, and I don't know if you've ever read any of those, but with Grindel, it started off as this crime lord who wore a costume, and basically he had a little bit of humanity, but he was still very much a villain. He wasn't like an anti-hero or anything. But then, like, spoilers for a comic that started back in the 80s, but the guy gets killed, but then the identity of Grindel gets passed on to different people, and it becomes a different thing with each person. Like, one person is a woman who's getting revenge for her son's death, and then one guy is a friend of hers who kind of just goes insane, and it's like different people take on the identity and the concept of Grindel, but it becomes a different thing for each person. And I feel like if you were going to do a sequel to this, which will never happen according to the director, that you could do something like that, where like this one is about postpartum depression and raising a kid who like has some kind of mental disorder, but then the next one could be about something totally different, and the Babadook could still be like a representation for that thing that you're doing a movie on.
Yeah, I can see that. That'd be... I think it could work really well, and I think someone just needs to... I think probably the reason we'll never get a sequel to this, or the reason a sequel may be unlikely, is because you would need a studio to offer the director not only the rights to produce it and the money behind it, to fund it and everything, but to maintain that level of creative control, sole ownership of the character. And that's not something many studios are liable to do for something they want to turn into a franchise. So I'm honestly not surprised. I honestly will not be surprised if we never get a sequel, but I could see that. I really do think there's a lot of potential for this. It makes me wonder... One moment, please, Mr. Ruben DeBoard. DeBoard? I never know how to say your last name. I always fuck it up. I don't know why. Duke fan film.
While you're looking for that, it reminds me, I don't know if you ever watched the TV series The League, but there was an episode where one of them had a fear of this guy from college that they called the Baba Man. And so, like, there's this clip on YouTube of just only characters from that episode saying Baba Man in a really creepy voice. And so watching this, anytime I hear someone say Babadook, it makes me think of that.
Okay. So I'm curious, though, because I do think that this is such a a good concept on a pretty shoestring level, and that it kind of works to the advantage of the low budget filmmaker, I will not be surprised that we'll never get a sequel. I guarantee you, keep an eye out on the Babadook fan films. Maybe I put too many A's in there. Let me remove one A, because I did find something called Monster, the Babadook short film.
That was actually the director. That it's kind of like M. Night Shyamalan, where like most of his movies are based on a short film that he did when he was a kid. I don't know how old the director was when she did it, but she did that movie before Babadook.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so maybe not yet. Babadook Castle fan video. So I don't know. Like it's a 4-minute film if it's actually a fan film. But there looks like there might be demand for a like fan-made sequel or something. It could happen.
Yeah, and that'd be interesting to see, especially because this had such a low budget, and like a fan film would be very unlikely to be able to get like what you were talking about, like the limbs stretching out and like climbing on the ceiling and stuff like that. You wouldn't be able to do.
You don't necessarily need it though.
Right. You could do a lot of horror stuff without a lot of those effects, like the first half of this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. All right. Well, what's that put us at? Minute 6 or hour 6? Minute 6. That was a lot of talking for a minute and 6 seconds. This podcast feels just as long as the Babadook. I don't know. I really don't have too much more on this one. It is a deeply interesting film. Again, probably the thing that impressed me the most about it is the pacing of it, how it can feel so long because you're just dreading it so much. Mm-hmm. That's really impressive. It's hard to pull off stuff like that. An hour and a half usually tends to fly by.
Yeah, especially in this day and age where most modern blockbuster, and this isn't a blockbuster, but most modern blockbusters are going to be around 2.5 hours long. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right, well, let's go ahead and go on to ratings then. Ruben, why don't you go first?
I think I will give this 4 catapults, backpack catapults out of 5.
Nice. All right. For me, I'm going to give this 4.5 out of 5. Ominous knocks. Dook. I really like that. All right. Well, Ruben, by request, we're going to check out something from a YouTube channel that does nothing but horror. It's called Crypt TV. They do some of their own content, creating own original characters, stuff like that. So we're going to review the first 2 seasons of Look-See, which is I believe, a completely original monster that they developed for their channel. So this should be interesting. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I am the Philosopher.
And I'm the Comics Kid 2099.
And we're your ghouly gentlemen, and we'll be discussing things from beyond the grave.
Ha 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 ha!